On this episode of Skeptiko.
You see, we always start from the fact that we are conscious. Consciousness is the only carrier of reality and existence that we can know. Everything else is abstraction, are inferences we make from consciousness. But our culture is driven by this notion that the real reality is outside consciousness. It's a material universe fundamentally independent of consciousness. And that our inner lives, our subjective experiences arise from specific arrangements of material in this abstract world outside mind. That's the philosophy of materialism, which underlies most academic work, underlies most of science as you know it today, but also underlies the value system of our culture, our economic system. For instance, if matter is the only real reality, consciousness being just a kind of transient, temporary side effect, then what meaning can there be to life but to accumulate material goods? And that feeds right into the economic system and feeds right into loops of reinforcement of existing power structures. So this metaphysical view of the world entailed by the philosophy of materialism determines not only what happens in academia and what your kids learn in school, but largely determines everything, the culture around, your relationships at work, the way we deal with the environment, the meaning of our lives, or at least how we see the meaning of our lives, how we spend our time, how we spend our money, how we see our relationships, and who we maintain in power.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on today's episode, we're going to return to a topic I think we cover a lot on this show, that is materialism, but we're going to approach it from a philosophical angle with a thinker that I highly respect, and I think you might have heard on this show before if you've listened to Skeptiko very much. Dr. Bernardo Kastrup is here, and he has a new book, and I think in this book he's really refined some of these arguments, exposing some of the flaws in this paradigm we call materialism that we seem to be so wed to both in science and as a culture. So we really drill into this topic. We not only talk about why materialism fails, and Bernardo's actually compiled a list of the top 20 or so most frequently used explanations for materialism that he then goes ahead and refutes, which is pretty interesting. But we also talk about some things such as memory and some of the research he's looked into that and how materialism comes into play there, as well as some interesting ideas about evolution as well. Finally, we talk about what all this means in terms of the big picture of life decisions, and Bernardo has some new and rather interesting ideas on that as well. It's a conversation that I greatly enjoyed. It's so fun to talk to Bernardo. He's such a brilliant, imaginative thinker. It's just a pleasure to be able to share this interview with you. I hope you enjoy it. Today we welcome back to Skeptiko one of your favorite guests, one of my favorite guests, philosopher and all-round great thinker on human consciousness, Bernardo Kastrup. And Bernardo's here to talk about his new book titled Brief Peeks Beyond, Critical Essays on Metaphysics, Neuroscience, Free Will, Skepticism, and Culture. It's a quite amazing book that expands on Dr. Kastrup's previous ideas about materialism and consciousness, but also expands those in some really cool ways that we're going to talk about on this show. Bernardo, it's great to have you back. Thanks for joining me on Skeptiko.
It's great to be here again, Alex. Always nice to talk to you.
So as I was just mentioning, you really try and hang it out there and cover a lot of ground in this book. Tell folks a little bit about what you're trying to tackle and what you're trying to say as you say in the book, what you're trying to say about the human condition in the 21st century. Give us it in a nutshell, if you would.
The book started as a series of things I've written over the years, some of which I published, some of which I didn't publish. And it was only more recently that the idea came up to make a book out of it. And once I started looking at the material I already had, I realized that they were fragment of a larger jigsaw puzzle, so to say. So immediately I moved the project on from just an ontology to creating a sort of an overview of the human condition in the present day, tackling every important aspect of it from a philosophical, ontological perspective. As the subtitle says, culture, neuroscience, what we consider ourselves to be. Are we just, biological robots, or are we creative consciousness? The influence of the media, the value systems of the culture, and how our philosophical views of the world influence all this, how they are reinforced by the media, how they determine our economic system, how they determine the way we live our lives. All of this forms a sort of idea gestalt about our condition, and it tries to highlight how a correct view of the nature of ourselves and the nature of the world could change this world and our culture and our civilization for the better.
Heady stuff. And you really do a great job of tackling that in the book. For those folks who are not familiar with kind of the basic premise of your idea, let's tackle that. You state in the book, our culture takes for granted that reality exists out there and is fundamentally independent of consciousness. That is that little voice inside our head. And you say that this postulate seems to explain a lot of things, and for this reason, we've allowed, as you just said, our values, our economic system, our political systems, we've allowed all that to be bound to this postulate. And it is your assertion that there's a lot of good reasons not to trust that assumption, right?
Yeah. You see, we always start from the fact that we are conscious. Consciousness is the only carrier of reality and existence that we can know. Everything else is abstraction, are inferences we make from consciousness. But our culture is driven by this notion that the real reality is outside consciousness. It's a material universe fundamentally independent of consciousness. And that our inner lives, our subjective experiences, arise from specific arrangements of material in this abstract world outside mind. That's the philosophy of materialism, which underlies most academic work, underlies most of science as you know it today, but also underlies the value system of our culture, our economic system. For instance, if matter is the only real reality, consciousness being just a kind of transient, temporary side effect, then what meaning can there be to life but to accumulate material goods? And that feeds right into the economic system and feeds right into loops of reinforcement of existing power structures. So this metaphysical view of the world entailed by the philosophy of materialism determines not only what happens in academia and what your kids learn in school, but largely determines everything, the culture around, your relationships at work, the way we deal with the environment, the meaning of our lives, or at least how we see the meaning of our lives, how we spend our time, how we spend our money, how we see our relationships, and who we maintain in power.
I want to pick out a word that you just used there, and you use it in your blog. It's actually the title of your blog, Metaphysics, and your blog at bernardokastrup.com is Metaphysical Speculations. But you just breezed past something that I think is just really amazing, and that is that materialism, that is this hard bedrock of science that we all rely on so much, is a metaphysical assumption. It hasn't been proven by experimentation. It hasn't been proven by observation. It's just embedded with a lot of assumptions. And yet you, as an idealist, someone who says that, hey, maybe consciousness is the fundamental building block of everything. Maybe consciousness is fundamental rather than matter is fundamental. You often get attacked as being, oh, those are just kind of metaphysical ramblings of a philosopher. Explain to us why materialism is really a bad form of metaphysics in and of itself.
Metaphysics is the study of the fundamental nature of reality, the underlying nature of what we see around us. It isn't science, and science cannot determine a metaphysics. The reason being that science is the study of the observable patterns and regularities of nature. the study of those patterns and regularities, and the modeling, the mathematical modeling, whenever possible, of those patterns and regularities in order to predict the unfoldment of nature. But the patterns and regularities we see are contents of consciousness insofar as we can ever know for sure. They are displayed in our consciousness. That's the only way we can know them, because knowledge is in consciousness. You cannot know what is not, has never been, and will never be in your consciousness directly or indirectly via the report of others. So materialism, by postulating that those patterns and regularities are fundamentally arising from a world outside consciousness, postulates as such the fundamental nature of what science can study. It's a postulate, it's not proven, and it's not even a scientific conclusion. It is an interpretation of scientific conclusions. It's a postulate of the fundamental nature of things. Of course, I would say it even cannot be proven. It is adopted as the mainstream view because it is seen as the only viable explanation for observations. I mean, when I go to sleep and I become apparently unconscious, I would say that I actually just don't form memories. We cannot say whether we were really unconscious or not, but that's another question. I become apparently unconscious and I wake up to where the world has gone, apparently without my consciousness. So how come reality is all in consciousness, right? Materialism seems, for instance, to explain this by saying, hey, the world is outside consciousness. That's why it goes on while you are asleep. So the adoption of materialism is based on this notion that it is the only game in town as far as being able to explain what's happening. But that, of course, is the very point that I attack in my work. I think it is not the only explanation, and it's not even close to being the best explanation. The reason being largely on the grounds of parsimony. It postulates too many entities that are merely theoretical. A whole world outside consciousness has to be postulated in order for materialism to add up to something viable. If you could explain all reality on the basis of excitations of consciousness alone, if there were a way to do that, then by definition, that alternative, more parsimonious metaphysics or ontology would win from materialism based on having the same or more explanatory power, but much less postulated theoretical entities. In other words, it would be a lot less metaphysical. It would be a lot more concrete, palpable, solid, because concreteness, palpability, solidity are qualities of experience. They are not qualities of an abstract mathematical world outside consciousness.
You know, Bernardo, you've just demonstrated something that you've become somewhat well known for, and that is taking on materialists. And you kind of have this take on all comers vibe, which I love. You know, you are not afraid on the internet, and I think in your panel presentations and stuff, to directly kind of confront some of this. I consider it craziness, so I'm going to say craziness, but you're just very matter of fact, and you really can put up a good argument. You do so in the book as well, and I love this section in the book. I think it's in chapter 2, isn't it, where you have the rebuttals?
That's right, yeah, essay 2.2.
Yeah, it's really great, and it's entertaining. I found it really funny as well. So I wanted to hit on some of these, and let's try and go through them kind of quickly because I have a lot of other questions and a real dialogue that I want to get into with you about some of the broader questions that you're thinking about, because I'm thinking about them too. But before we get there, I want to talk about some of these responses you have to the materialist position. And a lot of these, we should say, have come about through your dialogues with some folks. I'll start out with the first one, well-known biologist, Dr. Jerry Coyne, who for some reason is really highly regarded in the evolutionary biology circles. He's really not that smart of a guy, I think, but I love. So here's an example of the criticism that Coyne lays out, and then we'll hear what Bernardo has to say about it. But this is actually a quote from Coyne, or a paraphrasing. It's untenable to maintain that there is no reality independent of consciousness, for there is plenty of evidence about what was going on in the universe before consciousness evolved.
He actually wrote this in a very disparaging tone while criticizing something I had written. And he wrote it as if it was so obvious, and I
Yeah.
was so stupid for not seeing this. I mean, how dare I write these things without noticing that it can be so easily debunked? That was quite fun when I saw that.
Right. So
Well,
explain what's false about this, the miracle of the evolution of consciousness.
it begs the question very clearly. It's a form of circular reasoning. You see, the very point in contention is whether consciousness is generated by material arrangements in the form of biology, or whether consciousness is fundamental, material arrangements arising within consciousness, which is the point I make. When Coyne says that, oh, there has been plenty of evidence for the dynamics of the universe before consciousness arose, he's begging the question by assuming that consciousness arose with life within the context of an inanimate material universe outside consciousness. In other words, he's assuming his conclusion in order to argue for that conclusion. The position of idealism is that consciousness has always existed because it is the medium of existence. Everything arises as excitations of consciousness, even life. Life being dissociated aspects of this one medium of consciousness. So there was a universe before life arose, and that universe unfolded as the dynamics of consciousness as well. Before life, a specific type of consciousness dynamics ever arose within it. There's no problem in the idealist position about it, and there's all kinds of troubles in the way Coyne argued, because he just begs the question very clearly.
Yeah. I love the way you tear that apart. And that kind of relates into the second one that also made me chuckle, and I think you've kind of addressed this, so we probably don't have to cover it too much, but idealism is too metaphysical is the criticism. And I love that one because but I think you did a great job of actually, I think it's a silly criticism on one hand, but on the other hand, you kind of did a nice job of showing how it's actually, if you want to take it seriously, it's actually materialism that's too metaphysical.
Absolutely. You see, this arises from a misunderstanding of what materialism entails. What materialism says is that the world you actually experience, the world of colors, tastes, temperature that you feel, heat, cold, warm, whatever, this all arises within your head, inside your skull, because it's generated by your brain. And the real world out there has none of the qualities of experience. In other words, it isn't concrete. It isn't solid. It doesn't have colors. It doesn't have flavors. It doesn't have smells. But people forget that, and they immediately attribute all the qualities of experience to this outside world of materialism that supposedly exists outside experience, which is a categorical error. It's a mistaken attribution. But the moment you make that mistake, you think that materialism accounts for the solidity and the palpability of the world. It doesn't. It postulates that the real world is pure abstraction, impossible to visualize, and that everything you know as experience arises within your head. From that perspective, it's a highly metaphysical interpretation of reality. It's more metaphysical than any spiritual ontology, even dualism, because under dualism, there is a spiritual world that you will directly experience one day at least, maybe after you die. But under materialism, the real world of materialism is fundamentally and forever inaccessible. All you can access is a sort of a copy of it, a representation of it inside your head. There's nothing more metaphysical than that.
Here's the next one, and this actually sounds kind of scientific. You label it as criticism number 9. Unconscious brain activity precedes the awareness of certain decisions, showing a clear arrow of causation between material processes and experience.
I would not even question the scientific work that motivates this conclusion, although there's a lot of debate around it.
But tell people a little bit what they're alluding to scientifically there.
There have been some experiments in which a volunteer is asked to make a decision about when, for instance, when to press a certain button while his brain activity is being measured. And researchers can anticipate when the volunteer is going to make the decision, before the volunteer actually makes the decision, or before the volunteer is aware that he made the decision. So researchers can tell before the volunteer knows that he's going to make that choice. And then it gets interpreted as brain activity that is fundamentally unconscious, preceding and determining your conscious choice. Gets interpreted as evidence for materialism and evidence for the idea that there is no free will. I will even grant that the experiments are correct, and I will question only the interpretation, even though there is a lot of questions around the accuracy of the experiments themselves. But you see, I think this arises from a fundamental error that is made under the context of the materialist worldview. And the error is this division of the world, not only the world as the world at large, but of mental activity, this division of mental activity across two distinct categories, one being unconscious mental activity and the other being conscious mental activity. I think that's a mistake. I think what's happening is a spectrum of consciousness. Some mental activity gets amplified, gets focused on, and eclipses other mental activity that isn't amplified, in the same way that the glare of the sun eclipses the stars at noon. You don't see the stars at noon, but they are there. Their photons are still hitting your retina. Technically, you're still seeing them. You just are not aware that you are aware of them because of this amplification of certain mental contents and the obfuscation of others. So I would say that it's much more parsimonious and to postulate, and it also has more explanatory power, to postulate that it's all in consciousness. And some contents of consciousness are amplified and therefore obfuscate other contents of consciousness. For instance, your viewers are now placing their attention on my voice and what I'm saying, but they are also breathing. And if they focus their attention on their breath for a moment, they will be entirely aware of the air flowing in and out of their airways and the diaphragm inflating and deflating and so on. Were these things out of consciousness a few seconds ago before I just said this, or were they in consciousness but just obfuscated by the awareness of what I am saying? So I take this idea further, and I would say the volunteer has made a conscious decision when the neuroscientists measured the corresponding brain activity, but that conscious decision was not amplified. It was obfuscated by other things going on, and it at some point arose in amplification, and the volunteer became not only conscious of it, but conscious that he was conscious of it. And that's the moment when he reported being conscious of it. So in summary, instead of unconscious mental processes and conscious mental processes, what we have is obfuscated, non-self-reflective mental processes and amplified self-reflective mental processes. In other words, things that not only we know, but we know that we know them. And there is this category error in neuroscience today by splitting this into two camps, which leads to all kinds of problems, not the least of which the hard problem of consciousness, which is precisely this idea of how on earth something that is fundamentally unconscious can magically become conscious. It doesn't. It has been conscious all along. It's a matter of degree, not of fundamental nature.
Yeah, the other thing that struck me about this is, and you kind of allude to this several times in the book, is that it's a perfect example of where our tools have defined our reality, right? So we develop all these kind of cool tools for looking at brain activity, and then they become the instruments to kind of reinforce this theory, which is the only theory that can be supported by the tools, I think it's exactly what you're saying in terms of where is the observer in this kind of process? I mean, where do you put the alligator clips and say who's observing what? But I think we've hammered that enough. But I think it's important that it sounds so scientific, but it requires a deeper, penetrating kind of philosophical perspective that you bring to it to really kind of lay it bare in terms of all its weaknesses.
People always apply a philosophical interpretation to what they are seeing, whether they are self-reflectively aware of it, whether they are cognizant of it or not. And scientists who say that philosophy is not needed, they are merely implicitly assuming a certain philosophical position without even knowing that.
Okay, Bernardo, let me move on to another couple of criticisms. And here's one of my favorites because it really captures the lack of deep thinking that seems to always accompany this goofy materialism. I hate to say it so conclusively, but gosh, we've both been doing this for a long time, and you kind of run down these rutted roads that have been so well worn that after a while you kind of see it coming. But you label this as criticism 14. Why would consciousness deceive us by simulating a materialist world?
This is a precious one, isn't it?
Yes, it is precious in the same way that a child says something and it's just precious. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but you just have to marvel at it.
I mean, there is so much prejudice embedded in it in a way that people are not self-reflectively aware of. It's amazing. I mean, as I write in the book, why did the sun deceive us for so many centuries by pretending to go around the earth? Why did the earth itself deceive us for so long by pretending to be flat? It's the same kind of question as asking, why is the universe deceiving us by pretending materialism to be correct? It's not the universe. The universe is what it is. The sun has always been doing what it always did. The earth has always been a spheroid forever. Since its formation. Nothing is deceiving anything. The only thing maybe that is deceiving is ourselves. Materialists are deceiving themselves by interpreting the world according to a certain perspective, a certain set of implicit hidden assumptions. And they are so committed to that, thinking so much from within the box, that when they are pushed out of the box, they ask this kind of question: why is the world deceiving me by pretending materialism to be true? Yeah, ask the sun why it deceived us by pretending to go around the earth. It's the same kind of question.
Yeah. Okay, one last one from this chapter 2 and your rebuttal to all these criticisms of idealism in favor of materialism. So the last one, and I want to use this as the last one because it bridges us into another subject that you tackle nicely in the book, and that is memory. But here's the criticism. Number 11, during dreamless sleep or under general anesthesia, we're clearly unconscious. Yet we don't cease to exist because we become temporarily unconscious. Obviously, then, reality can't be in consciousness.
Yeah, that's another categorical mistake. All we can assert with confidence when we wake up, if we have this impression that the whole night was a blank, all we can assert is that we don't remember being conscious. But there are so many other situations in which we don't remember being conscious. Do you remember being conscious on the 31st of January of 1978? I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, but I probably was.
Mm-hmm.
Any materialist would grant that to be a fact. I was conscious on that day. Something happens during sleep that I would say impairs memory formation. I would even postulate what it is, but I don't want to get into that level of detail in the interview. In the book, I explore this a little bit more. So all we can assert is that there isn't a memory of consciousness. We cannot assert that there was no consciousness. It happens so often that I wake up in the morning and I think, I had no dreams last night. It was a blank for 6 to 8 hours. And only to remember, maybe later in the day or the day after, remember a dream triggered by some event, triggered by something somebody said. And I remember, I had that dream last night. Suddenly I realized that I actually was conscious. This happens all the time. We cannot assert that we are ever unconscious.
It's interesting what you say, because I want to use it as a bridge into talking about something you cover in the book, and that's some of the latest research on memory and how that fits into this whole picture of materialism and whether or not it supports materialism. Can you tell us a little bit about what you discovered and what you talk about in the book?
If you look at the latest research, the reports that are coming out, the first thing you notice is that Everybody seems to assume the materialist idea that memories are physical traces in the brain, little files stored somewhere, either concentrated in a place or distributed.
And this is not only an implied assumption, but it's actually been asserted that, it's been the Holy Grail for a lot of years that, okay, we're just going to find it. We keep digging in that brain more and more. We're going to find the file drawers inside your head because they have to be in there, right?
Yes, this hypothesis is taken for granted. So people are looking for the material traces instead of stepping back and asking themselves, what is memory? What should we look for? Instead, they assume what they should look for, what they expect to find, and they go after it. And then what you see is a plethora of different research results coming out, all of them claiming to have made huge steps towards explaining memory along the materialist assumptions. But if you compare them, they contradict each other. Some postulate mechanisms that are intraneuron, within the neuron. Some postulate these mechanisms to be around the membrane, others in the nucleus. Some postulate interneural mechanisms along the synapses, the synaptical weights. And all of them celebrate victory. And if you just go with the headlines and the scientific digests that the media provides, you would be certain that we have found memory traces. The headlines say, oh, memory has been found. The specific place where a memory is stored has been found. And then you dig into the paper and you realize that what they actually found is that the same neurons light up when you're experiencing the event and when you are recalling the event. Well, that's not the question. Of course they both light up because the experience of a memory and the original experience correlate. They are more or less the same experience. Then the same neurons should light up. The question is, how the hell does the brain know during recall which neurons to light up?
Explain that last point again. That's really important because it gets to the meta question that is endless, right? If you really take that, right? So explain that again.
So I'll tell you what the experiment was. They put volunteers to watch some video clips, and they had some probes. It was not neuroimaging; it was physical probes going into the brain to read which specific neurons would light up. They had a resolution of a single neuron in that study. So while the volunteer was watching a video clip for the first time, they would record which neurons activated, and then later on, with the probes still in the brain, they would ask the volunteer to recall the experience of watching the video, to play the video back in memory. And lo and behold, the same neurons would light up. And then they claimed, if you read the scientific digest, the claim was that scientists have found precisely where memories are stored. Hey, wait a moment. Memory is the information that allows the brain to know which neurons to light up during recall in order to generate a reproduction of the original experience. That the same neurons light up is obvious because the experiences correspond, the original experience and the experience of recall. How does the brain know which neurons to light up? When I think of my deceased father and I have fond memories of my childhood, how does my brain know which neurons to light up in order to give me a renewed access to that experience? Where is that information stored? If you go through that specific paper I'm referring to, it's nowhere there. They didn't study it. There is no conclusion about it. So it's amazing how the media so easily errs on the side of the reigning paradigm. If the conclusion seems to reinforce materialism, there are no breaks. People just celebrate victory. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And, as I've seen it happen over and over again with near-death experience, and it's whatever the prevailing scientific orthodoxy is, like you said, that never gets past the headline. The headline always reports orthodoxy, and then you can dig into it and maybe find otherwise in the body of it. But as you report, and I think is particularly troubling, is where the research is really being reinterpreted and recast as something that it's not. But I guess that's gets to some of the cultural issues that you talk about in the book in terms of the depth that we are embedded in this materialistic culture.
Yeah, it's a stigmergy out there, as I say in the book.
Yeah, let's get to talking about that. One other little topic to kind of just touch on, because it's always interesting to me, and that's Darwinian evolution. And I think you make a great point about random mutation. But tell us about what you think is one of the missing points there in neo-Darwinism.
Yeah, so I probably will make some of your listeners not too happy with what I'm about to say, but bear with me because it gets better later on. I personally grant validity to Darwinian evolution. I think it makes sense. I think the evidence supports it, and there is sufficient evidence out there, not only in the fossil record, but in genetic studies, even laboratory experiments that manage to reproduce some small aspects of the process. So until I see more evidence coming up or a good argumentation against it, I grant validity to evolution by natural selection. In other words, to the idea that species evolve from other species by the accrual of genetic mutations that lead to a competitive advantage in the environment. Maybe the word competitive is not the right one, to a survival advantage in the environment. The problem is that many materialists and neo-atheists, they conflate this notion that I just described, and for which I believe there is overwhelming evidence. They conflate that with another notion for which there is exactly zero evidence. And that is the notion that the mutations at the root of the entire process, the genetic mutations at the root of the process, which are quantum events, that they too are random in the sense that they do not have any pattern. They do not reflect any trend, any goal, any telos. We do not know that. To know that, we would have to have a fairly complete set of raw genetic mutations before natural selection kicks in to discard or reinforce some of them, thereby creating a pattern. We would need a complete set of raw genetic mutations and run a randomness test on that set to see if there are any trends, if there are any patterns, if the raw mutations themselves didn't favor certain physiological or anatomical trends in different points in the evolution of life. We do not know that that is not the case. But the orthodoxy will say, hey, no, the raw mutations have no pattern, reflect no trend, reflect no intent. All the patterns that we see in nature today have been created by selection, by natural selection, and they were not there in the raw mutations themselves. I would question that. I'm not saying that there were these trends. I do not know because we don't have the data to say it either way. All I'm saying is that the certainty with which the orthodoxy conflates randomness of mutations with evolution by natural selection, for which there is evidence, that conflation, the certainty of that conflation, is based solely on a subjective belief system and not at all on evidence.
That's a great point, and it's one of those that just as soon as you say it, it becomes so obvious. You know, it's just I read it and I was like, wow, of course. Of course, that's just an assumption we're making. And what makes it even more suspicious is we can directly trace the origins of that assumption to this kind of materialistic nonsense that we've kind of are dispelling here in your book and in your previous books. I mean, there's a direct line there between one has to equal the other. And as you said at the very beginning, it's deconstructing some of these postulates, some of these assumptions that we're making that is where the real action is. So, Bernardo, one of the things you really tackle in the book, and you're very brave to do this, but the material we've talked about so far is all material that folks who are familiar with your work are going to be familiar with because you've talked about these things. You do a nice job in the book, we should say, of kind of organizing it and sharpening some of these points and crafting them a little bit further. There's a lot of new material in this book, folks, even though it's a collection of some essays that have been published before. A lot of them have been reworked and edited in a very good way. But then you expand on that and you really talk about some of the cultural aspects to this and cultural, political, educational. You really try and tie this together and draw the line between scientific materialism and the consumeristic, materialistic society that we've built around it. Tell us what your thoughts are in that in a nutshell. And then I want to really dialogue with you on that because this is something I've thought a lot about and And I think we can have some interesting discussion about it.
If I look at the alternatives for a ontology, a way to make sense of the fundamental nature of reality, it's striking to me how weak and precarious materialism is from a philosophical point of view. It's inflationary. There are many, and it doesn't have sufficient explanatory power. Not only does it postulate a universe outside consciousness that is fundamentally beyond knowledge and proof, it also leaves the question of how consciousness emerges completely unanswered. And guess what? For all we know, consciousness is all there is. So it leaves it all unanswered in a way. So how come did it come to dominate our value systems, our culture, and our civilization in general, even the economic system? I think the key strength of materialism is not philosophical. It's not that to anyone who really looks carefully into it. The key strength of materialism is its synergistic value, the synergy it has with the economic system and the power structures. Materialism will legitimize many things that are, I would claim, not human, not natural from the perspective of the human condition, and yet which are done all the time and are conducive to the accumulation of power, the accumulation of capital, in a way that has now spread throughout the world, not only in the West. I think that is the key strength of materialism, is the synergy it has with existing power structures, with the existing economic system, the existing cultural milieu as well.
But let me interject there, because don't we have a chicken and the egg problem when we say the existing culture, the existing economic system? Because there's an interactive process, an evolutionary process, if you will. But I kind of resist going there because I think social Darwinism is a horrible idea that's brought much evil and ill on the world. So I don't want to kind of tie evolution into it. But if we look at the competing systems that we've lived through historically, there's some advantages to this linking together of materialistic science and an economic system built on materialism.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not like one was created and then the other one came around. I mean, these things feed on each other. If you look at the history of it, materialism became dominant in the 19th century. I mean, it began to really grow during the Enlightenment, but it was in the 19th century Europe, when Britain was a world power and the West was colonizing and dominating the entire world. It was in that context, that geopolitical and cultural context, that materialism really took hold. Initially as a way to dispel superstition, that was its positive value, but by germinating and growing in that context of colonialism and Western capitalism and power, that male adolescent mentality of the 19th century, it came to reinforce male adolescent values, and that fed right into the economic system that grew after that, especially post-war. So to me, that synergy is very clear, and it began to rise very visibly in the 19th century when the values of the current scientific/philosophical approach to reality, namely materialism, were congealed in the establishment.
Right. So let me take that one step further and kind of move into the spiritual realm, which is something else that you kind of tiptoe into in the book, which I think is important, because ultimately, if we're moving beyond a materialistic understanding of who we are and moving to the idea that our consciousness is an extended consciousness of which we're only aware of a small part of it, we immediately get into all these spiritual questions. And I think there's an interesting corollary with some of the folks I've been talking to in the non-dual community, and I know you've intersected with those people, because there's a lot of folks in the spiritual community, and the spiritual but not religious community, the Zen community, the Buddhist community, all those things that have thought about these issues deeply for a long time. And one of the things that I get out of that I think has a corollary is that, maybe there's this idea that materialism is a necessary first step, a necessary starting point for all of us individually and maybe culturally as well. Because until we can manifest things, until we have force and power to do things, then we can't really transcend that, So if we're just these kind of hunter-gatherers that can't get our stuff together, we're always going to be victims of the next horde of Huns that are rolling over the hills that are just going to destroy us, because that's out there too. So are we seeing maybe a necessary step in this process, and maybe we should kind of look at materialism for what it brings to the table? What I always think about as a corollary is the quantum physics world and, the shut up and calculate model. I think we live in a shut up and calculate world, So these guys, these quantum physicists, were stunned by these discoveries they're making that didn't make sense, that didn't fit into their science, their view of the world. But they said, forget about that. Shut up and calculate. And with shut up and calculate, they built these amazing things that we now use and call our industrial or our technological kind of infrastructure. So I'm sure you can relate to this. Nothing worse than a spiritual seeker who can't pay their bills. What do you think about all that?
I think maybe implicit in your question is the suggestion that materialism is a necessary metaphysics for the development of technology and for a pragmatic, effective way of living in the world.
If not necessary, as you said, highly synergistic, So
I think materialism is highly synergistic with the economic system and the power structures that are in place today, but not necessarily with the effective development of technology and pragmatic, effective living and a certain degree of harmony with nature that allows us to have a good, long, comfortable life. I don't think materialism is necessary for any of that. I mean, even the example you mentioned, shut up and calculate, means basically that you are ignoring any metaphysics, any ontology. And materialism is an ontology, it's a metaphysics. When you say shut up and calculate, you're denying not only the quantum spiritual stuff, you're also denying materialism. You're just saying, shut up and calculate. We know what the patterns and regularities are. We know how they will unfold. We can build technology based on the predictions we can make accurately about how they will unfold. And we do not need any interpretation about what the essential nature of these patterns and irregularities will be in order to build technology and live pragmatic, comfortable lives. So I would answer your question in the negative. I would say, no, I don't think materialism is necessary for all that. I don't think it's a necessary step in anybody's spiritual development. I think it's an understandable and natural mistake that got reinforced for two reasons. Initially, because the 19th century cultural ethos was that you would have to have a theory of the universe that was as bleak as possible, because only tough guys and girls would face that bleak reality. And of course, materialism is fairly bleak, so it got reinforced like that. And eventually, it became reinforced by existing power structures in the economic system. I think that's all it has going to it, for it. I mean, I don't think it's a necessary step. I don't think...
Well, I think the other thing it has going for it is that this conceiving of the world as machines, as parts, turns out to be a really handy way to build stuff, right? Because we have a pretty good understanding. We've developed a pretty good understanding, a good cognitive ability about how to put these kind of pieces together and how to kind of produce stuff. So it's just kind of, again, it's synergistic. What I'd push you on is say, okay, so what's better? I often think of the jingoistic expression, that's here in the United States, America, love it or leave it, which just makes people cringe. Oh my God, America, love it or leave it. How horrible. But, materialism, love it or leave it. What do you have better to replace it with? And where can you point in our history where we've ever done better than what we've done with this kind of crazy shut up and calculate materialism? What's better? What have we demonstrated is better?
There you go. You mentioned Advaita Vedanta a couple of minutes ago, and you suggested that the ideas I'm putting forward are related or resonate with this non-duality approach of Advaita Vedanta. I agree. I'm getting more involved with it now because my attention has been brought to it so many times that I figured I better study and see what the correspondences are. And there are many. So if you ask me this question, I would say, well, go back to India 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and you would have a better ontology, not a better technology, not a more comfortable life, not a greater control of the environment. But these things are not ontology dependent. We developed our technology for other reasons. We developed empiricism. Empiricism is not associated with materialism. Empiricism basically means I'm going to observe the patterns and regularities of nature before I arrive at conclusions. You don't need to interpret those in order to observe them, in order to predict them. So I would take away technology from materialism as an achievement of materialism. Technology can be had even under non-duality ontologies, under consciousness-only ontologies, because nobody's denying the patterns and regularities that arise within consciousness and our ability to predict how they will unfold in the future. So I would point you back to India as an example. At the same time, I would say that it's amazing how the truth isn't a secret. People have been saying this in different ways for thousands of years. It's all out there and has always been. They have been saying that in different ways, some much more metaphorical, much more symbolic than others. We always go back to Advaita Vedanta because maybe it's the least metaphorical, the least symbolic, the more direct, explicit, even literal articulation of that. But even Christianity, if you really look carefully, and I'm not meaning to get into this today, but if you really look carefully, you see that in essence, it's saying the same thing again. The truth really is out there, has always been, but it's amazing how blindfolded we are, how much we are incapable of seeing it because we are locked into this cultural box, this implicit hidden assumptions of materialism, as reflected in the criticisms we discussed in the beginning of this interview, that prevent us from sticking our heads out and just looking around. It's all right there. It isn't a mystery.
Well said, and we'll pick up on that when we get to the end, and you have some great points about what folks can do, practical applications, or maybe we should say what folks can stop doing in order to move forward. Before we get there, I can't leave one of my hot topics that I love to talk about, and you talk about in the book, and that's, of course, conspiracy theories. And you have you're welcoming to the idea that there are these other forces that we have to consider, but you suggest that we shouldn't think of them as conspiracies as much as we should think of them as stigmergies, right? Am I saying that right? Stigmergy?
That's right, yeah.
So tell folks what a stigmergy is and why you think that's a better fit for some of the shenanigans we see subjected upon us, because we have to, one of the things that I think, like you just said, you stick your head up at one point and you say, wow, this is crazy. How did I get sold this materialistic nonsense that I live in I'm meaningless and I live in a meaningless universe. I'm not meaningless. This is crazy. And I think there's a corollary between the cultural things where people say, wow, how am I being forced on choosing between these two candidates that I would never choose, any of these idiots? Or why is my country supporting this war, this incredibly just destructive, dehumanizing murder of people? I don't support that. No one I know supports that. How did we get in this mess? And I think people have that, not only a sense of lack of control, but just a sense of, what's going on? What am I missing? What is the control mechanism that's in place that I don't see? So what is your take on that?
You're alluding to the fact that there seems to be order and structure out there that doesn't seem to be natural, that seems to require some active control mechanism in order to be maintained, because we look around and we see absurdity and we see things that are anti-human, and we ask ourselves, how can this be the case? How did it come to be and how is it maintained? How is this order maintained? There are two ways that we can explain the existence of order, unnatural order out there. One is top-down, the other one is bottom-up. Conspiracy theories would focus on the top-down enforcement of order. In other words, there is some kind of secret, extremely powerful cabal that is meeting, making decisions, issuing secret orders that then percolate down the chains of command and maintain that unnatural state of affairs, maintain that unnatural, sick, pathological order that we see in the world today. The other alternative is bottom up, and that's stigmergy instead of conspiracy. And the idea there is that every agent playing in this game, so every person in the world, when they take decisions and act in the environment, in other words, in the society, in the culture, in the civilization, their actions leave traces in the environment that cue and influence the actions of other agents. So if I am the boss of a company, my behavior will influence what my employees do. If I am a scientist, my behavior and my thoughts and my opinions will influence what my colleagues choose to do, think, or like or dislike, and so on. It's the way ant colonies operate. Ant colonies are incredibly sophisticated. I worked in artificial intelligence a few years ago, and they are so sophisticated that we tried to emulate the behavior of ant colonies in order to solve complex engineering problems. Ants are capable of sophisticated agriculture, architecture, engineering, complex defense systems. And yet there is no boss. There's no cabal. There's no top-down power structure. The queen only produces little ants. It doesn't command anything. So how does that order emerge in an ant colony? It emerges through stigmergy, through bottom-up cueing between agents. And I think that's how materialism today is largely maintained. You get the cues from the environment about what opinions and actions from your side will give you an advantage. How do I progress in my career as a scientist? Do I progress if I'm not a materialist? Do I get research grants and publish papers if I follow a research avenue that seems to contradict materialism? I don't. So reinforce that. And the moment you do that, other people will look at your papers. They will look at your behavior. And your papers and your behavior, the traces you leave in the environment, will cue their choices, their research choices, their opinions, the things they publish. The same goes in the corporate world. The same goes in the media. If I'm a journalist and I'm reporting on the latest scientific results, I'm much safer if I err on the side of the reigning paradigm than if I stick my head out there, go on a limb, and I report something that is anti-materialism. If it turns out I'm wrong, I lose my job. People look at me and say, how did you dare do this? Obviously, that couldn't be right. So, as a journalist, I would choose to err on the side of materialism. And of course, that cues the environment. You're the media. People will read what you wrote, like those papers about memory, papers about the effects of psychedelics. People will be cued on that. And it creates a sort of self-reinforcing cultural dynamics that emerges bottom up. It creates a kind of virtual cabal that reinforces a pathological order, a pathological state of affairs that only benefits those that are pathological themselves, that only benefits diseased pathological power structures.
First of all, I totally agree with you that that's at play for a lot of this. But I have to add that I think it's a mistake to overlook the top-down part of this process as well. And I'm always amazed at folks who are, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but are too quick to dismiss the conspiracy theory because it just doesn't really feel right to think that there might be that control mechanism on the top. And that's why I've really spent some time digging in as far as I can to some of these conspiracies, and I think they're important. I'll just throw out one that is really easy for anyone to confirm for themselves, and yet has huge implications for just the kind of topics you're talking about, and has this really synergistic relationship with the stigmergy that you're talking about as well. And that would be the war on drugs. You know, we've really, in the United States, America, have really been the spearhead on the war on drugs. If you look at the history of the war on drugs, our Central Intelligence Agency is up to their eyeballs in drug running, and has been for the last 50 years. In the 50s, in Southeast Asia, well documented. In the 1980s, Australia. In the 1970s and 80s, Panama. The whole Iran-Contra thing, 1980s, Central America. We're flying in introducing crack cocaine in the United States. The CIA is the largest drug lord in the world. So if people don't believe that, then they need to go look at the dozens of books that have been written, but also the declassified documents. Hell, the whole Iran-Contra thing, you couldn't get more public. It was a public display of our highest-ranking officials saying, this has happened. We had plausible deniability by our president, so we would do these things and he could deny them. So when we unravel a conspiracy like that and we say, okay, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that on one hand, your government, your scientific establishment is telling you, oh, there are these chemical substances that alter your consciousness and you shouldn't touch them. And they're really bad and there's this war on them. And then how do you reconcile that with the fact that your government is profiting from, in a secret way profiting it, putting it in this black box over there that they can go spend on all these horrible things that they do. I say you got to push through and you got to fully embrace that reality. You have to dig into it. You either have to say, okay, that's not true. That's not a reality. I'm wrong. And that, there's another thing out there. Or you have to go all the way in and say, oh my God, that is a reality. And now I think you have to marry that reality with the other things that you're talking about because they are synergistic. That's what I've always maintained. If there are these top-down systems of control, then we're really in trouble because imagine the power and influence they can have when you have a system, as you said, that kind of runs its own conspiracy like the anthill without anyone doing anything. Well, now imagine somebody has the ability to come along and step on this anthill and not step on the other one. I mean, it's a great power.
I agree completely with that. I don't deny that there can be top-down conspiratorial activities going on out there. In the book, I implicitly say that there is one. When I suggest that the power of materialism is synergy with the current power structures, I am appealing to that notion that there is a top-down a top-down motivation to maintain materialist-inspired, materialist-validated cultural values because it favors consumption. I mean, if you're just a biological robot and you're going to die, there's no problem that we wreck the Earth. We are not going to be around to see it anyway.
See, but I think it's harder to draw the line between that and someone directly profiting from that. And I think that's the problem people have. And I think that's why people are more comfortable with, as you did a very nice job of explaining, is the stigmergy kind of explanation, is that, hey, yeah, we all realize that this is kind of to our benefit, so, well, let's independently do it. What I think is that what if you really do have some power structures that really reside above that? I mean, I don't really, because when it comes to materialism, I don't think there's a secret board that meets once a year and decides, okay, this we should do, this we shouldn't do to protect materialism from being exposed for the craziness that it is. I don't think there is that board, but I think there is this group in the CIA that, accumulates all this, like when we invaded Afghanistan, and Afghanistan today, after the invasion by the United States, produces 10 times the amount of heroin that it did before the invasion. Well, I think that's going in somebody's pocket to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. And I think those dollars are being used to create some of the ills that you and I were talking about, and that we all sit around and go, wow, why is that army forming and doing this and that? So I think there's more of a direct line that we have to kind of at least consider than just kind of the less clear line that just independent actors.
I don't reject that. I think I emphasized stigmergy because it was the other point of view that I think is overlooked. But I don't deny what you're saying. I would suggest that conspiracy enforcement, in a way, hitches an easy ride on existing stigmergies. I mean, you're talking about the drug issue. Clearly, by forbidding drugs, we create an enormous economic incentive to deal with drugs because the prices go up, and governments may be using this. I don't deny that possibility. But you see, where did that come from? I think it came from a stigmergy that originated from the hysteria of a uptight, anal-retentive middle class in the 1960s. The hysteria against ego dissolution that came with certain types of drugs that led to politicians only being able to be elected if they were explicitly anti-drug. So now maybe there are top-down structures, top-down groups that hitch a ride on that stigmergy and profit from it. I would suggest maybe something similar happens with materialism. I think materialism is based on a stigmergy, but there are top-down powers, top-down power structures that benefit from it and feed it through maybe conspiratorial ways. I don't deny that possibility.
Okay. So, Bernardo, in this book, Brief Peeks Beyond, again, is the title, you do an admirable job at the end of kind of addressing the how do I implement this in my life question? How do I make my life better based on what you're telling me? And I thought you very skillfully avoided the kind of heavy-handed ideas about what people should run out and do today, and instead focused on maybe some things that folks might want to rethink and stop doing, to put it kind of bluntly. Tell us as many of those as you'd like to cover. I thought they were really excellent, but we can cover as many as you like, but
I'm going back to the book here just to mention them in order. I
got them right here. I got them right here. So if you're okay with mentioning, I don't want to give away people. You need to go out and buy this book, and I'm sure you will. It's available on Amazon right now. You can buy it. You really enjoy it. It's something you're going to want to have on your bookshelf, share with other people. So we are asking Bernardo to share some of the secrets in the book, and these 5 are great. So as long as you're willing to, let's go through them. The first one is, let's stop compulsively stupefying ourselves.
Very good. Well, but Alex, maybe before I just jump into them directly, maybe just a short preface. The reason I was motivated to talk about what we could stop doing as opposed to what we could do is that I think it is part of our insane cultural system today that anything that has any significance, anything that has any use, any value, is action. It's something that you have to do. I think that's part of this cultural value system that we could do away with. It's a symptom of the pathology. So I try to look at it from a different perspective, you see, because if you're hitting yourself in the head with a hammer, the right course of action is not to get yourself a helmet, but to stop hammering.
That's excellent.
Right?
Yeah.
So that was my motivation to do that. And the first one is maybe the one I'm most passionate about at a personal level, not necessarily the most important one. Let us stop compulsively stupefying ourselves. I think there's a lot going on in our inner lives, in our personal consciousness, if you will, that goes unnoticed, that gets obfuscated. These are parts of ourselves, ideas, feelings that we don't want to confront because they are painful. They're parts of ourselves that we reject, that we repress, and we don't want to acknowledge. But the only path back towards meaning in life is to look ourselves in the eye and acknowledge what's going on within ourselves. What are our pains? What are our fears? What are our regrets? What do we really feel? What do we really think? Where do we really see meaning? It's not from what society tells us. It's from that little resonating musical instrument within us that either resonates or doesn't with the environment around us, with what we are doing, with what we are being told. I think focusing back on that is the only path back to meaning and back to truth. But what do? we don't want to confront that, so we stupefy ourselves with all kinds of distractions, fanatic rooting for sports teams, alcohol, watching idiotic television shows, shallow relationships on social media, compulsive dating, all kinds of things that we do. I think if we would stop doing that and just rest with ourselves in silence a little bit, not the whole day, just maybe half an hour, and just be with ourselves, listen to ourselves. What do we really feel? How do we really feel? What do we really want? What do we really think is meaningful? And be honest to ourselves. I think that goes a long way in changing things.
Awesome. Number 2, let us stop believing so readily.
And here I don't mean only believing in the fringes of the culture, some of the hysterical things that are being promoted around, and which I am no champion for and not fond of either. I mean so readily believing in the mainstream cultural story. We so readily believe in materialism. It's so easily inculcated in us. We never stop to question. We never stop to look at the implications. I think we would do well if we stopped believing so easily. And by that, I don't mean to turn into cynics. Cynicism is a form of belief. It's the opposite side of the same coin. It's an unjustified commitment to the impossibility of something. That's also a form of belief that's not based on reason, it's not based on evidence. I think we should nurture a way to relate to ourselves and the world that was known in the old days, but it's less known today, which has been called negative capability, the ability to live in the mystery, to stay with the doubt, and not too quickly reach after some fact, some piece of reason, some logic, some system, some model, in order to cover the vacuum that you have by not knowing. If we would abide in the not knowing a little bit more, I think things could improve as well.
I really like number 3. Let us stop acting so much.
Haha. We act everywhere, don't we? I mean, I used to act a lot. It's changing in recent years. We all try to put up that mask of strength, of harmony. We want to look good. We want to look happy. We want to look strong. We want to look trouble-free. We want to look attractive. But deep in our heart of hearts, we know that we suffer. Everybody suffers. It's part of the human condition. It's one of the noble truths of Buddhism. Life is suffering. But by putting out that persona, that image, we add insult to injury, right? Because since everybody's hiding their suffering, and we know that we are suffering, we think we are the only souls in the world that is lost in suffering, lost in pain, lost in fear, lost in regret, in anger, in insecurity. Guess what? Everybody is. And I think it would be much better if you would stop hiding that and have the courage to just present ourselves to the world the way we really are. And if we are doubtful and insecure, and if we have fears, let that be seen. Because everybody will recognize that in themselves, and finally we will have a chance to build a real community and help each other out, instead of playing this theatrical game of strength.
Let us stop eating so much meat. Explain.
That is not for the usual reasons, like better health, although they may all be true. But you see, one of the essence of my worldview is that consciousness is the one medium of all reality, and that individual people, individual animals are just dissociated complexes, dissociated alters, dissociated personalities of that one consciousness, but that our individual psyches are united at a deep and obfuscated level because we are all arising as mental processes of one mind. So if we raise animals for meat, they turn into products, and then the harsh realities of production, the harsh realities of our human shadows kick in and ensure that these animals will have horrible lives and will die in horrible ways, and this way introduce unfathomable amounts of horror, of ghastly pain into our collective obfuscated mind, what I call mind at large. So I think by doing this, by killing literally millions of higher animals in horrible ways and having them live horrible lives every week, for unreasonable amounts of meat consumption, we are introducing horror into our own psyches, into our own minds. And I don't think we are immune from that. It may be obfuscated, but every now and then it will emerge like a volcano erupts. And I don't know to what extent our condition as human beings today is influenced by that. I'm not advocating that we all turn into vegetarians. It may be a good idea. I tend to prefer a vegetarian diet myself, but I'm not going to be I'm not going to deny that animals kill other animals for food in nature. This happens all the time. So eating meat may be a natural thing, but not in the industrial scales we practice today, and we shouldn't close our eyes for the psychic consequences of that.
Yeah, I almost see it as an outward expression of point one about stupefying yourself. So if you can really wrap your mind around the commercial production of meat and the suffering of animals and the slaughter of pigs that we have to acknowledge are just as smart as your dog over there, because it is. If you can really wrap your mind around that, then go ahead on with your bacon. But most people can't, and this is your point. I think most people really can't. But they have a conflict there. So what they do is the stupefaction process of saying, oh, no, don't tell me any of that. Don't let me think about any of that while I'm enjoying my sandwich here, my breakfast meat. And then I won't think about it later. So I think that's a great point. And your last one is, let us stop buying so much unnecessary stuff.
Yeah, this is the more maybe politically related of the five. It relates to stupefying ourselves as well, because of the so-called retail therapy that you see in the world today. People who feel better if they go shopping, buying stuff they don't really need, just to numb what's really going on inside them. I think this is particularly bad because it plays right into the hands of the stigmergy of materialism and the existing power structures in the existing economic system. It feeds into the notion that human beings are just cogs in the machine, that the meaning of life is to participate in production on the one hand and then consume on the other, that there is no higher meaning, that there is no meaning related to a greater understanding of our condition as human beings and our relationship to the world, that there is no meaning in expressing ourselves as creative agencies in the theater of existence. All of that gets rejected for production, consumption, and reinforcement of power, for feeding egoic structures. I think you could change that theoretically with a political street revolution. There are many people who advocate that today, but I don't think that is the most optimal way. For one, it's violent and it may not be the most effective. You see, there is one thing we can all stop doing and which is impossible to repress, and that is to change our patterns of spending. Nobody can throw you in jail because you didn't choose to buy this or that. And if we all would change our patterns of spending, the entire system would have to readjust. And this readjustment would probably be painful in the beginning. We are in a local minimum now. So to dislodge the system from that local minimum so it can eventually arrive at another point of equilibrium in a more healthy way, that dislodging that will cause pain. But it probably will not be as violent as street revolutions, and it cannot be repressed. I think we would go a long way if we would just ask ourselves, does this thing I'm about to buy really enrich my life in a sustainable, long-term way? Or will it just give me a high for the next day or two, maybe the next week or two, and then it will be completely meaningless to me? If the latter is the answer, I would suggest, don't do it. Stay with yourself a little bit more. See what your inner life really resonates with, what really gives meaning to your life. Maybe it's a walk in nature. Maybe it's painting something. Maybe it's writing something, expressing yourself creatively in the world in some way. Maybe it's a deeper relationship of the people with the people around you, not only online text messaging or private messaging, but something deeper, more heart to heart. Maybe it's helping other human beings who are in need. There are so many other things that could be more enriching and more meaningful than just going for the next shopping high.
I think that's well said. And, we could even expand on that a little bit further. And, You talk a little bit in the book about the unsustainability of the system that we've built, and I'm not sure I'm totally with you on that, but I would just kind of recast the whole thing as saying, look at what our system has created as this kind of tremendous substrate on which we can grow ourselves towards a transformed individual and a transformed society. And by that, I mean, we have all the tools now, right? You're listening to this podcast. You have this great technology. You can share these fantastic thoughts with somebody who's thought about this stuff really deeply in Dr. Kastrup here, or you can go sample hundreds of other people that have. That's a huge advantage that many people throughout history would have just died to have that kind of thing. We have that now. We can take advantage of it. What most of us, listening to this show at least, have a relatively fantastic wealth from both a historical perspective, but on a worldwide basis. What can we do with that wealth? So we have the ability to make those choices, which I think is terrific. You won't starve if you choose to make your choices different. And I think that's a great starting point that we've been afforded by this shut up and calculate materialism. Love it or hate it, it's given us this opportunity to move beyond it. And gosh, I think it's a great opportunity to grab it.
Absolutely. There are opportunities today that there have never been in the entire history of mankind, of humankind. So I am with you in that. There are opportunities there.
So this book, again, Brief Peeks Beyond, it's a great book. You can find out more about it. You can search for it on Amazon, but you got to check out Bernardo's website as well. I'll have it linked up in the show notes. It's just bernardokastrup.com. And he's got a great YouTube channel, too. I've really enjoyed some of the videos I found there, and I have some more queued up, so I'll probably have some private conversations with you after I've watched some of those. But he's got some really well-done videos that you're going to want to check out as well, and that's easy to search for him on YouTube. Bernardo, it's been fantastic having you on. I'm sure we'll have a real stimulating discussion about some of these things in the forum and in other places afterwards, but it's been great having you on Skeptiko. Thanks a bunch for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's always very nice to be here. It feels like one of those chats we have when we are not making a podcast.
Right. Those are the best.
This almost reaches that level. It was very nice. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup for joining me today on Skeptiko. I guess there's one question that I'd tee up from this interview that really intrigued me, and that is the synergistic relationship between materialism and our economic system. Do you think such a relationship exists? And if you do, how do you think it comes into play? And what does it say for what might lie beyond this materialistic paradigm that we're in, which so many people think will get past because the evidence is so overwhelming, and then others of us say, wow, there's really no reason. There's such a strong motivation to stay within this paradigm that maybe we'll just stumble along this way for a lot longer. So what do you think about that? Let me know. The place, of course, to do it is through the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com, where you can leave a comment on the website, jump over to the forum and join the discussion there, or send me an email or link up with me on Facebook. Always good to connect with folks that way as well. So I have a number of interesting shows coming up. They'll be coming at you once a week here for a while until we can clear up this backlog that I've created by talking to all these amazing and interesting folks. So I hope you have your iPod or other device. I've actually switched over to a new device, but then I'm a bit of a techie, so I'm always looking for new gadgets. Anyway, do stick around. Lots more to come. Until next time, take care and bye for now.